Think about the central Christian ritual of Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper. At its heart are two simple, powerful elements: bread and wine. For nearly 2 millennia, from the Last Supper in that upper room in Jerusalem, through the Roman catacombs, the medieval cathedrals, and the Protestant Reformation, the fruit of the vine shared by believers was, quite simply, wine. Fermented, alcoholic wine. It was a symbol of joy, of celebration, of blood, and of covenant. Deeply rooted in both Jewish tradition, like the Passover Seder, and Greco-Roman culture, the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, Lutheranism, Anglicanism, they all maintained, and still maintain, the use of actual wine as essential to the sacrament. And yet, today in the United States, if you walk into one of the hundreds of thousands of evangelical churches, a Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, Presbyterian, or non-denominational service, and you participate in communion, you will almost certainly not be given wine. You will be handed a tiny, thimble-sized plastic cup of grape juice. How did this happen? How did a ritual that, for 1,800 years, was defined by the use of fermented wine, get so completely and totally changed by a massive segment of modern Christianity? Was it based on some new biblical discovery? A lost manuscript? What if I told you the answer has almost nothing to do with ancient theology, and everything to do with a 19th-century American social crusade? And what if I told you that the unfermented wine in your communion cup was not invented by a theologian, but by a teetotaling dentist from New Jersey, who saw a business opportunity in a moral panic? This is the surprising, uniquely American, and relatively recent story of how a powerful social movement, and one very clever inventor, revolutionized one of Christianity's oldest traditions. This is the story of the invention of sober communion. Before we get to the Great American Revolution, we must establish the undisputed historical baseline. For the first 1,800 years of the Church, the liquid element in the Eucharist was wine. The context of the Last Supper itself was the Passover Seder, a Jewish ritual meal that requires the drinking of 4 cups of fermented wine. The cup of blessing that Jesus took was, by all historical accounts, a cup of actual, alcoholic wine. When Jesus performed his first miracle at the wedding in Cana, John 2, he didn't turn water into grape juice. He turned it into oinos, the Greek word for wine that was so good, the master of the feast was astonished. The early church fathers, like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus in the 2nd century, explicitly described the Eucharist as a celebration involving bread and a cup of water and wine mixed, a common practice in the ancient world. Throughout the Middle Ages, the debate was never about using wine. The debate was about who got to drink it. Even the Protestant reformers of the 16th century, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Huldrych, Zwingli, were radically questioning every church tradition, never questioned the use of wine. They fought bitterly over what the wine meant, but that it should be wine was a given. For them, to substitute it with something else would have been unthinkable, a direct violation of Christ's institution. So, for 18 centuries, from Jerusalem to Rome to Geneva, the cup of communion was a cup of fermented wine. To understand the radical change, we must leave ancient history and travel to a very different time and place, 19th century America. The 19th century United States was a nation with a serious drinking problem. Alcohol consumption was incredibly high, and its effects public drunkenness. Domestic violence, poverty, workplace accidents were devastating. In response to this very real social crises, one of the most powerful and transformative social movements in American history was born, the temperance movement. What began as a call for moderation, temperance in the early 1800s quickly evolved, especially under the influence of evangelical Protestant revivalism, into a crusade for total abstinence, or teetotalism. Alcohol, in any form, was no longer seen as just a substance that could be abused. It was reframed as an inherently evil, sinful, and corrupting substance. It was demon rum. It was the devil's brew. A true saved Christian, the argument went, could not and should not touch a drop. This new, absolute moral stance created a profound theological problem for these same evangelical churches. How can you preach from the pulpit on Sunday morning that all alcohol is a satanic poison, and then, an hour later, serve alcoholic wine at the communion table as the sacred symbol of Christ's blood? How can you ask reformed alcoholics to come forward and participate in a ritual that requires them to taste the very substance they are fighting to avoid? This was a massive, glaring contradiction, and it sparked a fierce debate within American Protestantism, known as the communion wine controversy. Churches were torn. On one side, the traditionalists, often in more established liturgical denominations, argued that the Bible was clear. Jesus used wine. Therefore, the church must use wine. To substitute, it would be to disobey Christ's direct command and break a 1,800-year-old tradition, all for the sake of a modern social movement. On the other side, the temperance reformers argued that the spirit of the law was more important than the letter. They argued that using an intoxicating substance in a holy sacrament was a terrible moral example and a dangerous stumbling block for the weak. They began to look for a non-alcoholic alternative, an unfermented wine. This created a market demand. But there was a major technical problem. How do you get unfermented wine, i.e. grape juice, and keep it from, well, fermenting? In an age before refrigeration, grape juice would naturally begin to turn into wine almost immediately due to the wild yeasts on its skin. For decades, churches tried all sorts of methods. Boiling the juice, creating a thick, syrupy wine that tasted terrible, using raisins soaked in water, or even, in some desperate cases, using water colored with molasses. They needed a better solution. They needed a scientific breakthrough, and it came from a very unlikely source. Enter Dr. Thomas Bramwell Welch. Dr. Welch was a British-born dentist and physician living in Vineland, New Jersey. But more importantly, he was a devout, card-carrying Methodist and a passionate teetotaler. He was a communion steward at his local church, and he was deeply troubled by the idea of serving alcoholic wine, especially to former alcoholics. He was convinced there had to be a way to preserve pure grape juice without it fermenting. In 1869, inspired by the new food preservation techniques of the French scientist Louis Pasteur, Dr. Welch had his eureka moment. He knew that it was the yeast on the grape skins that caused fermentation. So, he gathered Concord grapes from his own backyard, meticulously squeezed them, and filtered the juice. Then, in a brilliant application of pasteurization, he sealed the juice in airtight bottles and heated them in boiling water, killing the natural yeasts and any other microbes. The result? The world's first shelf-stable, commercially viable, unfermented grape juice. It's crucial to understand his motive. Dr. Welch didn't invent this product to sell at the grocery store. He wasn't trying to create a kid's drink. He invented it specifically and exclusively to serve as a non-alcoholic communion wine for his church and other like-minded temperance-supporting churches. His original marketing slogan was literally Dr. Welch's unfermented wine. The adoption was not immediate. Many churches were still skeptical. But Welch was a relentless marketer, and his son, Charles, also a dentist, saw the massive commercial potential beyond the church market. When Charles took over the company, he started marketing it as a health drink at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The company exploded. But its original success, its entire reason for existing, was theological. It solved the central problem of the temperance-minded churches. It gave them a product that looked like the fruit of the vine, but was free from the demon rum. The Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, and countless other evangelical denominations began to adopt Welch's grape juice as their new communion standard. A 19th-century American social movement, powered by a 19th-century technological invention, had successfully and permanently altered a 1,900-year-old Christian ritual. But how did these churches justify this radical change? Theologically, the traditionalists had a powerful argument: Jesus used wine, period. The temperance reformers needed a counter-argument from Scripture, and they developed one, known as the two-wine theory. This theory, now rejected by virtually all modern biblical scholars but immensely popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries, argued that the Bible actually speaks of two different kinds of wine. 1. Owenos Greek, yea in Hebrew. These words, they argued, were generic terms that could mean either fermented wine or unfermented grape juice, depending on the context. 2. The good wine. They claimed that whenever the Bible speaks of wine in a positive context, like Jesus' first miracle, or the Last Supper, it must have been referring to pure unfermented grape juice, the fruit of the vine. 3. The bad wine. And whenever the Bible warns against wine, for example, wine is a mocker, do not get drunk with wine, it was referring to the evil, fermented, alcoholic version. Therefore, they concluded, the wine Jesus used at the Last Supper was not alcoholic at all. It was pure grape juice. And by using Welch's unfermented wine, they weren't changing the sacrament. They were restoring it to its pure, original, non-alcoholic form. This two-wine theory provided the perfect theological cover for the change. It allowed churches to adopt grape juice not as a modern substitution, but as a biblically mandated restoration. Today, while the scholarly two-wine theory has been debunked, most scholars agree Owenos and Yan almost always refer to fermented wine in the Bible, a natural and normal beverage in the ancient world. The tradition of using grape juice has become so deeply embedded in American evangelicalism that it is now simply the way it's always been done for generations of believers. The original, 1,800-year-old tradition of using actual wine is now the thing that seems strange, foreign, or even unchristian to millions of American Protestants. So, the story of the grape juice in your communion cup is not a simple one. It's a fascinating, uniquely American story, a perfect storm of social crises, a powerful moral movement, and a clever technological innovation, pasteurization by a teetotaling dentist. It's a story of how a modern social ethic, the belief that all alcohol is inherently sinful, became so powerful that it overrode nearly 1,900 years of unbroken Christian tradition, and even spurred a new and, according to scholars, flawed interpretation of the Bible to justify itself. And this brings us to the final, fascinating debate. What does this story say about how religion evolves? Is the switch from wine to grape juice a brilliant example of pastoral wisdom and adaptation? Is it a case of the church rightly prioritizing the spirit of the law, protecting the vulnerable? Like alcoholics over the letter of the law, the specific substance used, adapting its ancient rituals to meet the real-world, modern challenges of its people? Or is it a dangerous historical and theological error? Was it a profound compromise, where a temporary culturally specific moral panic, the temperance movement, was allowed to permanently alter a sacred ritual instituted by Christ himself? Did these churches, in their zeal to be sober, accidentally water down the very sacrament meant to represent the new wine of the kingdom, and in the process, disconnect themselves from the historic, universal church's practice? What should be in the cup, and who gets to decide? The words of Jesus, the tradition of the church, or the pressing social concerns of the day? Let me know your thoughts, respectfully, in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the hidden history of your communion cup fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content that uncovers the surprising origins of our beliefs and practices. Thanks for watching.